had a House hearing on issues facing Border Patrol officers. Union officials discussed several challenges, including assaults on federal workers. Arizona Congresswoman Martha McSally chairs the 90-minute Homeland Security Subcommittee hearing.
The Committee on Homeland Security Subcommittee on Border and Maritime Security will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to examine the challenges United States Border Patrol agents and U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers face in carrying out their mission to secure our nation's border. Before I begin, I'd like to start with a moment of silence for Border Patrol agent Rogelio Martinez, who was killed in the line of duty last year in Van Horn, Texas. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Agents and officers of U.S. Customs and Border Protection work every single day to secure our nation, often in rugged terrain, sometimes in very remote areas far away from the amenities of modern life. They're exposed to blistering heat of the Arizona desert and the brutal cold in places like Havre, Montana. Working at the nation's ports of entry, the men and women of CBP are the driving force behind our border security operations. The nation is fortunate they are willing to endure hardship to make sure the border is secure. Agents willing to take significant risks on every single shift to ensure that cartels cannot smuggle drugs and dangerous individuals across our border or through our ports of entry with impunity. It is dangerous work, made more dangerous because agents are subject to frequent assaults. Some of them have the potential to kill or cause grave bodily harm. Just a few weeks ago, an agent in San Diego was patrolling the border on an all-terrain vehicle when he was struck in the chest by a grapefruit-sized rock, causing him to lose control of his ATV, which subsequently rolled over on him. Thankfully, the agent has been released from the hospital and will recover. But this type of assault is far from an anomaly. Many other agents have been seriously injured by sizable rocks thrown over the fence. On the screens to the left and the right, we've put up photographs of some of the gruesome injuries, or we're putting up photographs, some of the gruesome injuries suffered by our brave agents during these rock attacks. Unfortunately, such assaults are becoming more commonplace, in part because of the increase in the number of criminal aliens attempting to cross the border illegally, who would rather resist arrest than face jail time for parole violations or a felony reentry charge. More should be done to ensure that those who assault agents are held accountable and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. CBP has two key missions: securing the border and facilitating cross-border commerce that powers the nation's economic growth. But in order to accomplish those missions, CBP needs enough agents and officers to be able to make arrests, interdict drug loads, screen cargo from countries of concern, and move commerce and passengers through air, land, and sea ports of entry. U.S. Border Patrol agents and CBP officers are, at the end of the day, the most important border security and trade facilitation resource we have. Unfortunately, they are in short supply these days, which has created a national security and economic vulnerability that this Congress must address. CBP is critically understaffed and remains well below its congressionally mandated staffing levels by more than 1,000 CBP officers and 1,900 Border Patrol agents. The manpower shortage is getting worse. We are losing ground every single month, and there is no end in sight as we continue to lose experienced agents and officers through attrition without the ability to efficiently hire new ones. The President has smartly called for the hiring of an additional 5,000 agents, but we have to ensure CBP is set up for success to not only hire those additional agents in a timely fashion, but also to retain them in the future. The U.S. Border Patrol has not met its mandated hiring numbers since fiscal year 2014, and CBP has been losing officers since early in FY16. Several underlying issues are directly responsible for these current staffing woes. For starters, it takes more than 292 days and 12 distinct steps, on average, to hire a new officer or agent. Very few people can wait somewhere between 6 months to a year for a job. On top of that, CBP officers and agents are required to pass a polygraph examination. However, the pass rates have not kept pace with the demand for more officers and agents. Earlier this year, the House passed my bill that would allow the Commissioner of CBP to waive the polygraph requirement for current state and local law enforcement officers who have already passed a polygraph examination, federal law enforcement officers who have already passed stringent background investigation, and veterans with at least 3 consecutive years in the military who've held a security clearance and passed a background check. These small changes will provide CBP with immediate relief so they're able to quickly yet judiciously hire officers and agents from a pool of qualified qualified applicants that already maintain the public's trust and put their lives on the line for our security and safety on a daily basis. The challenges for our agents and officers are significant, which is why I've called this hearing today. I think it will benefit the members of the subcommittee to receive firsthand testimony from the line agents on the ground. I want to hear your perspectives on what it will take to secure a border, listen to your firsthand views on the hiring, retention, and mobility challenges that have plagued CBP for the last few years, and finally discuss some solutions to the troubling and increasing trend of assaults on our agents. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Vela, for any statement he may have.
Thank you, Chairwoman McSally, for holding today's hearing, and thank you also to our witnesses from the National Border Patrol Council and the National Treasury Employees Union who have joined us today. Given the ongoing debate on border security, hearing directly from the unions that represent thousands of Border Patrol agents and Customs and Border Protections officers working on the front lines will be greatly beneficial to this subcommittee. Over the past several months, the White House and senior administration officials have insisted that building a border wall from coast to coast will keep out illegal drugs, criminal aliens, and other threats. However, CBP and U.S. Coast Guard officials have testified before this subcommittee time and again that the solutions to these threats are broader than simply using physical barriers. This subcommittee has heard that vast quantities of narcotics are interdicted in the transit zone near Central and South America and at our maritime borders. We know that U.S. Coast Guard and CBP air and marine operations need modern assets to keep up with the flow of illegal narcotics in this transit zone. We have heard how drugs are smuggled into the United States in massive cargo containers through our land ports of entry, through the express mail and postal system, through tunnels under fences, and by ultralight aircraft and drones. We know that people are smuggled and trafficked into the United States through legitimate forms of travel, and others come here legally but overstay. Data also shows that people on the terrorist watch list are encountered by CBP along our northern border significantly more frequently than along our southern border. Furthermore, the majority of these individuals present themselves at ports of entry rather than try to sneak into the country. To address these threats, CBP relies on screening and vetting techniques, technology, infrastructure, and, most importantly, its officers and agents. CBP faces serious challenges in recruiting and maintaining a professional workforce to accomplish its mission, and these challenges are only getting worse. I have mentioned multiple times this Congress that CBP's hiring and retention problems pose an unacceptable self-inflicted risk. Based on its workforce staffing model, CBP's Office of Field Operations needs to deploy an additional 2,500 CBP officers to ports of entry in order to meet demand, and it does not include the more than 1,000 vacancies still left unfilled since the last time Congress authorized a staffing increase. This is a known, factual, documented need. I understand that over the holidays, CBP officers assigned to some of the busiest land ports of entry along our southern border were working multiple 16-hour shifts to keep up with the flow of travelers and commerce. This situation is bad for the officers, and it is bad for border security as well as legitimate commerce and trade. Border Patrol agents are under pressure to maintain vigilance and professionalism in the face of cartels and other criminal actors who endanger their safety. Both Republican leadership in Congress and the administration would be wise to address these critical staffing and personnel needs before considering a multi-billion-dollar border wall. At the same time, Border Patrol agents must contend with using outmoded communications technology and deteriorating forward operating bases in remote regions along our borders. CBP has a duty to treat these men and women fairly, equip and compensate them appropriately. Manpower is a critical component of border security, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about their experiences, trends and threats they have seen on the front lines, and what they would like to see CBP do to address and prevent the exploitation of our borders by those who seek to do us harm. All members support you in your efforts to secure our nation's borders while ensuring the flow of legitimate trade and travel that drives our nation's economy and upholding the ideals that make America great. Again, I thank the Chairwoman for holding today's hearing, and I thank our witnesses for joining us. I yield back the balance of my time.
Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We're pleased to be joined today by 4 distinguished witnesses to discuss this important topic. Mr. Brandon Judd is the Border Patrol agent and the president of the National Border Patrol Council, representing more than 16,500 Border Patrol line agents. He brings with him nearly 20 years of experience as a Border Patrol agent. Mr. Judd is currently a Border Patrol agent assigned in Montana. Mr. John Anfinson has been a Border Patrol agent for 11 years and is currently assigned to the Del Rio sector in Texas. He spent several years working in the prosecutions unit, including 2 years as a liaison to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Del Rio, Texas, and is certified as an EMT. Agent Anfinson is the local president of the union in Del Rio, Texas, and last year he was elected as a national vice president with the National Council. Ms. Rosemary Pepperdine began her career with the U.S. Border Patrol El Cajon, California. During her 21-year career, she has apprehended numerous aliens, seized multiple drug cases, as well as worked for multiple agencies on different task forces, and is here from my town, Tucson, Arizona. Mr. Anthony Reardon is national president of the National Treasury Employees Union. He is a leader of the largest independent federal sector union, representing 150,000 federal workers, including 25,000 Custom and Border Protection employees. Reardon has over 25 years of hands-on experience addressing the concerns of frontline employees. The witnesses' full written statements will appear in the record. The chair now recognizes Mr. Judd for 5 minutes to testify.
Chairwoman McSally, Ranking Member Vella, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, I would like to thank you for inviting me to testify today in order to communicate the significant challenges that our nation's Border Patrol agents are facing. My organization and I have a long-standing relationship with Chairwoman McSally and Ranking Member Vella. In fact, I really appreciate everything that you two do for our agents. My name is Brandon Judd, and I currently serve as the president of the National Border Patrol Council, where I represent approximately 16,000 Border Patrol line agents. I have 20 years of experience as a Border Patrol agent and a thorough understanding of the policies affecting border security, and I'd like to discuss a few issues with you today. The debate over what to do with undocumented immigrants in the United States has been raging for as long as I can remember, and the debate will continue as long as people from other countries are able to sneak across our borders, evade apprehension, and disappear into the shadows of society. In short, until the borders are secure, we will continue to have hearings such as this, and border security and illegal immigration will continue to be politicized and will continue to be a polarizing topic that divides liberals, moderates, and conservatives of all parties. In a recent town hall meeting, a United States Senator asked a packed conference room of Border Patrol agents what percentage of illegal border crossers in their individual locations are apprehended. The answers ranged from 40 to 60%. He then asked what percentage of narcotics that are smuggled across the border are detected and seized. The percentage went down exponentially. The senator wasn't surprised, and in a later private meeting, he asked me what the proper percentage would be to consider the border secure. My answer was that the percentage could vary from location to location, but a secure border would be achieved once it became too difficult for criminal cartels to turn a profit and the risk outweighed the reward. Unfortunately, and as we speak, we still have work to do. Illegal cross-border crime, including human smuggling, is a multi-billion-dollar industry and is controlled exclusively by organized crime within and without the United States. These criminal enterprises, cartels, are constantly evolving and adapt to our enforcement postures. The cartels have come to realize that we are far more reactive than proactive, which makes it easy for them to stay one step ahead of our enforcement efforts. In some cases, the cartels will expend a great deal of money and resources to dig expensive tunnels, bribe government employees, build elaborate compartments in vehicles, and many other measures to get their contraband across the borders illegally. Most of the time, however, against us. Over the past year, we've seen a historic drop in the number of people entering the United States illegally. The administration's simple promise to enforce the laws was all it took to send shockwaves throughout the world. Less people were entering the were entering the country illegally, which meant Border Patrol agents weren't being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. It became much more difficult to cross the border illegally, and I believe we were putting a dent in the profits of the criminal cartels. Due to such, assaults on federal agents with a border security mission increased by 76% in 2017 compared to the previous year. In order to combat this issue, we must understand what I believe are the three drivers: cartel violence, criminal aliens attempting to illegally re-enter the United States, and manpower. As previously stated, all of the human and narcotic trafficking along the border are controlled by drug cartels. The cartels are extremely violent and have killed an estimated 150,000 people, including law enforcement in Mexico. I believe that the violence we are seeing is simply a spillover from the chaos on the other side of the border. The other thing is criminal aliens attempting to re-enter the United States. For obvious reasons, criminal aliens are more likely to assault Border Patrol agents, and until fully prosecuted, I believe the assaults will continue. Manpower is also a huge issue. We are currently almost 2,000 agents below the congressional floor of 21,370 agents. The President has proposed the hiring of 5,000 additional agents, which we fully support. The committee has included the 5,000 additional agents in the Border Security for America Act, and I want to thank the committee for doing so. However, this year, there is only a proposal to fund 500 new agents. At this rate, the agents we hire this year will be halfway to retirement before we meet the goal of an additional 5,000 new agents by 2028. In the field, manpower equals response time, whether it be a sensor hit or an agent fighting for his life. Currently, we have agents covering large-scale areas where the nearest backup may be more than 15 to 20 minutes away. As someone who has had to struggle to arrest a violent subject on more than one occasion, that kind of response time is equivalent to no response at all. I fear that the level of violence that we are seeing now may become the new normal. This is because the new primary drivers of the violence, cartels and criminal aliens, are most likely going to get worse, not better, in the years ahead. We need to focus our efforts on what we can change. This includes more manpower and ensuring that any assaults on an agent is fully prosecuted. I want to thank the committee for your time, and I look forward to answering any of your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Judd. The chair now recognizes Mr. Anfinson for 5 minutes.
Good morning, everyone. Chairman McSally and Ranking Member Vela, I want to thank you for inviting us to the committee and affording us the opportunity to testify this morning. My name is John Anfinson, and I've been a Border Patrol agent for about 11 years. I've been assigned to the Del Rio sector my entire career. I spent several years working in the prosecutions unit, including working 2 years at the U.S. Attorney's Office. I want to discuss with you this morning the issues of retention and recruitment and how they affect Border Patrol's operations in the field. As many of you know, law enforcement is a difficult career. The hours are long and often unpredictable. We work weekends and holidays. We miss out on birthdays and anniversaries. And unfortunately, we sometimes see the worst in humanity. And all of this takes a toll not only on us, but our families. Although there are challenges with this profession, I work with a lot of really great people who truly care about border security. They have become a second family, and after 11 years in the job, I still look forward to going to work every day. Whether we're arresting undocumented immigrants who recently crossed the border, interdicting drug smugglers, or rescuing undocumented immigrants lost in the brush, I believe our work makes a difference to this country. However, there are aspects of being an agent that present a challenge when it comes to recruitment, retention, and morale. Unlike many other federal law enforcement agencies, Border Patrol works shift work that covers 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. We operate in some of the most unforgiving environments in the country, and some agents struggle to make it to retirement with a career filled with injuries. We often work in communities that lack quality health care, schools, and employment opportunities for our spouses. So I'd like to first start by addressing agent retention. The Border Patrol is only as good as its employees. If we can't retain quality personnel, we will never be able to secure our border. As Brandon Judd has previously testified, we're approximately 2,000 agents below the congressionally mandated floor of 21,370 agents. And this deficit is largely due to the result of two issues. The first is the agent is facing a significant wave of retirement of agents who were hired in a large hiring push in the early 1990s. And the second is agents just leaving the Border Patrol before they're due to retire. Currently, the Border Patrol has a 6% attrition rate, which is nearly twice the government-wide federal law enforcement attrition rate of 3.2%. Agents routinely transfer to other federal law enforcement agencies for a whole host of reasons. And compounding the problem is the pay disparity that Border Patrol has with competing agencies. In 2014, Congress passed the Border Patrol Agent Pay Reform Act. This legislation modernized the overtime system that agents had used for over 40 years and for the first time gave agents a stable pay system. This legislation, which we supported, was originally revenue neutral. However, through the legislative process, the Obama administration forced through a savings cut of $100 million per year in the final law. And as a result, the average agent took a pay cut of approximately $5,500. We only supported the legislation because the agency had begun limiting agents' AUO, which began affecting agents' monthly pay and retirement. It's our understanding that it costs approximately $180,000 to recruit, hire, and train one new agent. So, that means that with every agent that we lose, taxpayers are losing $180,000. If agents were properly compensated and that compensation leads to retaining agents, it will lead to a net gain for the taxpayer. The Border Patrol cannot be successful if our attrition rate remains nearly double what our sister agencies are facing. Therefore, we have to address this pay disparity. The National Border Patrol Council has already initiated discussions with the Trump administration to eliminate this gap. However, I hope that Congress might be able to play a positive role in resolving this issue. On the recruitment side, we face similar challenges. This committee, through the Border Security for America Act, has supported the administration's proposal to hire 5,000 additional agents. In order to do this and account for attrition, the Border Patrol will need to hire and train approximately 2,729 new agents every year for the next 5 years. But to put this in perspective, in 2016, we hired, trained, and employed only 485 new agents. At this hiring rate, we're not able to keep up with attrition, much less add manpower. The single biggest hindrance to hiring is the polygraph. I know this is a controversial subject, but as you likely know, the Border Patrol is failing approximately 2 out of every 3 applicants, which is double the rate most law enforcement agencies see. So there's clearly a problem with how we're administering the polygraph. In response, last year this committee passed the Anti-Border Corruption Reauthorization Act, which gave the CBP the ability to waive the polygraph for certain law enforcement officers and military service members. And we believe this is a positive step forward, but it's not the only solution. The bottom line is we need to start administering the polygraph correctly and stop treating applicants like criminal suspects. Despite the support the Border Patrol has received from the current administration, our ranks are still plagued with low morale. CBP has thankfully begun to seriously look at employee resiliency, including morale, but until we get everyone in the agency on board with the concept that employee morale is part and parcel of effective border security, we will continue to lose more agents than we can hire. Many of the agencies that do well with recruitment and retention are able to provide a portfolio of the benefits and perks which make their agencies a desirable place to work. Now that all law enforcement agencies are having to compete nationwide for a shrinking pool of applicants, Border Patrol needs to do a better job of making itself more competitive and desirable, both for current agents and prospective employees. We have to get a handle on this situation sooner rather than later because the adverse effects of low morale and attrition oftentimes are not detected until years later, usually when it's too late to fix the situation. I want to thank the committee for your time this morning and look forward to answering questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Anfinson. The chair now recognizes Ms. Pepperdine for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman McSally, Ranking Member Vela, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, I would like to thank you all for inviting me to testify today. I began my career with the U.S. Border Patrol in 1996. During the first half of my career, I was stationed in San Diego sector, and in 2005, I transferred to the Tucson sector. I am proud to work side by side with the resilient men and women of the Border Patrol who are driven to address the challenges that our nation faces along the border. I would like to address 3 themes this morning that highlight how we can more effectively utilize our limited manpower. Currently, 653 miles of the 2,000 miles of southern border is fenced at a cost of nearly $7 billion since fiscal year 2007. This fencing consists of 353 miles of primary fencing, 300 miles of vehicle fencing, 36 miles of secondary fencing behind the primary fencing, 14 miles of tertiary fencing behind the secondary fence. Fencing is a tool that allows agents to maximize their available manpower. It is not, however, a single solution to illegal immigration and drug trafficking. Illegal immigrants and drug traffickers routinely go over, under, and through existing fencing. Fencing without the manpower to arrest those who penetrate it is not a prudent investment. What fencing does do is allow us to maximize our manpower. Generally speaking, in areas where there is no primary fencing, it takes 1 agent to secure a linear mile of the border. However, in areas where there is fencing, we can increase the range of an agent to 3 miles. With that said, I want to be clear about our position on fencing. Our first priority is placing secondary fencing behind the primary fencing that we already have. This can be done quickly and at a nominal cost. To put this in perspective, The 36 miles of secondary fencing already in place was constructed for $2 million per mile. Beyond secondary fencing, we believe that only about 300 additional miles of primary fencing is needed. The 300 miles of new fencing would focus on areas such as Del Rio, Laredo, and the Tohono O'odham Indian Reservation in Arizona. Effective communication is both a force multiplier and a critical component of agent safety. In CBP's fiscal year 2017 congressional budget request stated that 18,000 units lack adequate security voice encryption, 25,000 units have exceeded their useful life, and 35,000 units cannot communicate with state and local law enforcement agencies. For most of my career, I have been issued a radio that oftentimes does not work in the field. The primary issue is the lack of signal coverage. Essentially, if you are not within close proximity of a CBP radio tower, you cannot communicate. When working in remote areas alone and without backup, an inoperable radio quickly becomes a safety issue. Many times in my career, I had a visual of a fellow agent but could not communicate via my service radio, and in some instances, I had to use my personal cell phone to communicate to other agents. With that said, the Council would like to thank the committee for including language in the Border Security for America Act, calling for future radio procurements to include LTE capability. Most likely, everyone in this room has a smartphone with a LTE capability. Right now, there are LTE-capable public safety radios that can operate on CBP's radio communication system. If a signal is not available, you are able to switch to a commercial LTE provider. This LTE capability is a quantum leap forward and will greatly improve both agent safety and effectiveness. The Border Patrol is an extremely top-heavy organization with far too many layers of management and convoluted chain of command. Although Congress has appropriated funds to double the size of the Border Patrol, we have unfortunately not doubled the number of agents in the field. To put this in perspective, the average large-sized police department has one supervisor for every 10 officers. The Border Patrol has one supervisor for every 4 agents. Why do we have twice as many supervisors as other large law enforcement agencies? Your guess is as good as mine. The reason, in my opinion, that this imbalance has been able to persist is that in headquarters there are only about 300 agents. The real management bloat has been at the sector and station level. In some sectors, we have more agents assigned than we do at headquarters. The Council has long advocated that Congress should force the agency to right-size its management structure to something more in line with other law enforcement agencies. In addition, allow me to offer another efficiency Border Patrol should definitely pursue: processing. Anyone arrested by Border Patrol is brought back to the station and processed before being turned over to either ICE or voluntarily returned to their country. This includes taking biometrics, running a criminal background check for outstanding warrants, and filling out the appropriate paperwork. Depending on how busy it is in some locations, you can have 15 to 20% of the agents bogged down processing and not active in the field. In comparison, many police departments have civilian employees who make considerably less than officers handle the bulk of the processing. Thank you for your time this morning. I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Pepperdine. The chair now recognizes Mr. Reardon for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman McSally, Ranking Member Vela, thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of over 25,000 frontline customs and border protection officers, agriculture specialists, and trade enforcement specialists at CBP who are stationed at 328 U.S. air, sea, and land ports of entry and at pre-clearance operations overseas. First, I'd like to say that NTEU supports the nomination of Kevin McAleenan to be the next CBP commissioner. That said, there is no greater roadblock to border security, stopping illicit trafficking in people, drugs, illegal weapons, and money, and to ensuring legitimate trade and travel efficiency than the lack of sufficient staffing at the ports. The current CBP officer shortage is indeed staggering. There is a vacancy rate of nearly 1,200 funded CBP officers at the ports. And according to CBP, an additional 2,500 CBP officers needed to be funded and hired in order to meet 2018 staffing needs. So as of today, there is a total CBP officer staffing shortage of 3,700. The economic cost of this shortage is also staggering. For every 33 additional CBP officers hired, the U.S. can potentially gain over 1,000 private sector jobs. If Congress fully staffed the ports, 112,000 private sector jobs could be created. Understaffed ports lead to long delays in travel and cargo lanes, and also create a significant hardship for frontline employees. Both involuntary overtime and involuntary work assignments far from home disrupt CBP officers' family life and destroys morale. An example of the negative impact of staffing shortages can be found at San Ysidro and Nogales, where CBP has instituted involuntary temporary duty assignments, or TDYs. Starting January 7, a new round of 175 CBP officers are being sent from other ports to Nogales, which is critically understaffed. However, these TDYs then create short staffing situations at other ports of entry, such as the Orlando International Airport, where airport officials have taken to Congress their concerns with losing 10 CBP officer positions to TDYs. Many of you have toured the San Ysidro Port of Entry. The screens show a typical day there. As you can see, there are 26 primary vehicle lanes with up to 2 booths at each lane, a total of 50 booths. Approximately 60,000 vehicles and 25,000 pedestrians apply for entry each day. Over 139,000 on a daily basis, travelers on a daily basis. In the photo insert, you can see the pedestrian crossers. Today, this port has over 200 CBP officer vacancies. By the summer of 2019, this port will expand to 32 lanes with 62 booths. Imagine working up to 16 hours a day, days on end, with no relief in sight. But neither the President's January 2017 executive order nor the FY 2018 omnibus include any new funding even to meet today's onboard staffing needs at the ports of entry. The CBP employees I represent are frustrated that Congress does not seemingly recognize that securing the ports of entry is just as vital to border security as is securing the borders between the ports of entry, and that the ports are an economic driver of the U.S. economy. However, NTEU does have concerns with CBP's decision to award a multi-million-dollar contract to augment CBP's hiring process. While we support increased hiring efforts, NTEU believes this money could be better spent by utilizing available pay flexibilities on actual officers to incentivize new and existing CBP officers to seek vacant positions at hard-to-fill ports of entry. It is imperative that Congress fund CBP officer new hires to alleviate the ongoing CBP staffing shortages at the ports of entry. Thank you, and I am happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Reardon. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. First, I just want to say thanks to all of you and to those that you represent for what you do every single day to keep us safe. Having been a veteran, oftentimes we're thanked for our service for wearing the military uniform. People forget there are men and women out there every single day keeping our country safe in the capacity that you all represent and what you're doing to also keep us safe and putting your lives on the line, literally, for potential death or injury in the line of duty. I want to open up with the issue of assault. I'm very deeply concerned about the rise of the assaults on our agents. And as you mentioned, Mr. Judd, they're often out there by themselves with manpower shortages, remote areas with long distances for others to respond to help them. And they get hit with a rock, they get ambushed, and they're out there on their own. Thanks for your insights as to what is driving those assaults, but what can we do like right now? We have men and women right now out there risking their lives on shift right now. What can we be doing? And what does the American people need to hear about what's happening with our agents and these assaults? And what can we do in order to better protect them and make sure that those who assault our agents are held accountable for their violence?
Your last comment is exactly what needs to be done. We have to hold those that assault our agents accountable. Unfortunately, very few of those who assault our agents are prosecuted for assault on a federal law enforcement officer. And when we do that, we send a clear message that our laws aren't going to be enforced, and it incentivizes individuals to try to assault our agents in an effort to get away.
Why do you think that is?
I think that it's the sheer numbers. If you look at how many U.S. attorneys we have, we just don't have the resources that are necessary to prosecute the number of assaults on agents. I want to make one thing very clear. Just like people in the military, and we appreciate your military service, our agents understand what they're getting into when they put the uniform on. They understand that they're going to do a dangerous job. And as we've seen border crossers drop, our agents understand that it's going to be a little bit more violent out there because they're going to try to get away a little bit more. This is one thing that we're willing to take on in order to secure the border.
Do you think it is a bandwidth issue or a will issue in the prosecutions? We don't have, oversight of judiciary, but we certainly can work with our colleagues in order to raise this issue and with the administration.
I believe it's a bandwidth. I think that the U.S. attorneys want to see justice brought to those who assault our agents. They just don't have the resources to do it.
Okay, thank you. Is it safe to say, I've heard you all talk about the morale issues across the board with your agencies and CBP, but do you agree that since the new administration has been in office that morale has improved at the higher level of understanding that there is now a will and a desire to give you the tools that you need to do your job, that you've been unshackled from restrictions in the past? I think, again, about my military experience. Sometimes you have a new commander at the highest level that changes the environment and the culture, and that in and of itself boosts morale, but it still takes a while to kind of trickle down through mid-level bureaucratic issues or equipment or everything you need to do the job. But has there been a shift, and do you see that every day out there on the job?
Last year, morale was probably about as low as it could get. So with the new administration showing the support that they're showing, it's helped, but it can only do so much. So morale it's hit or miss. There's some places we have good days and bad days. I think part of the issue is, part of the improvement has been that we have an administration that clearly supports what we do, and that's been a great improvement. But there are still issues within the agency that are going to take a while for us to get through. The agency is starting to pay more attention to morale, but we're still seeing issues in the field where there are managers who feel that it's just not their job to be worried about that.
Ms. Pepperdine?
I noticed that our sector, that morale is definitely at an all-time low. I don't believe it has anything to do with the administration. I believe it's been more of the pay reform that Mr. Atkinson spoke about earlier. Many agents weren't happy, even though we had to settle for a more stable pay system, which was overall better for all of us. A lot of people are upset that they lost pay and are doing the same dangerous job for less money.
Great, thank you. Mr. Ritter, do you have something to add to that?
I do. Yeah. I think the morale for the folks in Office of Field Operations, CBP officers, remains dangerously low. I think it is really related to the staffing issues that I raised, where you have individuals who are working 16-hour days on end. I just heard a story this morning, in fact, that in one pay period, we had a CBP officer work 73, hear my words, 73 hours of overtime. Where you have that happening, and when it happens days on end, week after week, the impact on that individual in terms of that person's health, the impact on that family is, and I might add, the impact on the potential for maintaining high security in the ports for our country, it's a major problem. I would also offer this in terms of the health. One of the things that really concerns me is over the last probably year and a half, maybe 2 years, I have heard, and I get these calls late at night or whenever it happens, that there has been a dramatic increase in the number of suicides among CBP officers. There has been, I've heard from the agency, a dramatic increase in the number of substance abuse cases, a dramatic increase in the number of domestic violence cases. And so what I would urge is that, yes, we have to take care of staffing, yes, we have to take care of morale, but part of the issue that I think has to be looked at is what are the root causes of those things, because they impact, they're part of morale. And until we start figuring out the answer to those questions and start taking care of these officers, we're going to have serious problems.
Thank you, Mr. Reardon. I am over my time. Before I hand it over to Mr. Vela, I just want to say I so appreciate some of the things that you've raised for the American people to hear, and we will continue to be partners with you on this issue, these issues. Retention is, I think, a very important top issue. If you're going to have to replace people, retaining those you've already trained and have all the experience is of the utmost importance. And additional duties and CWEEP are things that need to somehow be taken off the agents' responsibilities and given to other support personnel or others, and we're just going to continue to partner with you on all these issues. So I want to now recognize Mr. Vela, my ranking member, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Congresswoman McSally. I'm going to yield 5 minutes to Congressman Demings because she has to go to Judiciary Committee hearing. But before I do that, I want to follow up on the assault issue real quickly with Mr. Judd. You mentioned that there's a 76% increase in assaults during the past year. I'm wondering if you can put that in the context of how many more assaults were there this past year than before then, so we can have a real-time idea of the number of assaults we're talking about. And secondly, give us a sense as to whether or not the assailants are they actually, I couldn't figure out, are they actually being arrested and just not prosecuted, or are they getting away and not arrested? If you could kind of elaborate on both those issues.
So the total number of assaults in 2017 were 774. 76% of that, I'm no mathematician, but 76% of that, I would say that it would be somewhere around 300 assaults took place in 2016. These individuals are being arrested. The vast majority that assault our agents are being arrested. The vast majority just aren't being prosecuted. When you think about 776 assaults on agents, 776 prosecutions is pretty overwhelming for the U.S. Attorney's Office.
So why don't we, after this hearing at some point during the next few weeks, just feel free to come, let's meet in the office, and that way we can go into that a little bit more. But with that, I'll go ahead and yield 5 minutes to Congressman Demings.
Thank you so much to our chairwoman and also to our ranking member for yielding. Good morning, and thank you so much for being here. I so appreciate the service that you are giving and the people that you represent who are working hard every day to keep our nation safe. I'm from Orlando, and I served as the police chief in Orlando. I served 27 years at the department, and 5 of those years I was assigned to the Orlando International Airport. I was assigned to OIA during 9/11. And I'd like to start, Mr. Reardon, by thanking you for highlighting the concerns regarding the Orlando International Airport, particularly losing 10 officers indefinitely for temporary duty assignments at the Southwest Land Ports of Entry. Almost 3 million international passengers arrive through OIA each year. And while we are thankful to have them visit our great city, we must make sure that we still provide an efficient and safe operation. That almost 3 million number represents an 89% increase since 2009. However, the CBP officer staffing levels have remained unchanged. I want you to think about that. It's remained unchanged, an 89% increase. The level remained unchanged, and now we're talking about sending 10 very valuable and important officers to work somewhere else. Mr. Reardon, I know that would not work for municipal law enforcement officers to be able to do that much with less and still maintain the same level of service that we expect, again, to be efficient and effective. Could you please tell me, based on your experience, I feel funny even asking you this question, but is it reasonable that the same number of officers can process almost double the number of international passengers? And what would such a strain, wouldn't such a strain become worse by losing 10 officers as opposed to reaching the staffing levels that we so desperately need?
Congresswoman, thank you very much for your comments, and thank you for the question. I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that losing 10 officers in Orlando, for example, is going to create a serious problem, and I think it's a problem that we see across the country. Where you are short, where our country and the Office of Field Operations is short 3,700 officers nationwide, it puts, as I had indicated previously, a strain on the system. It puts a strain on individual officers to the point that I'm choosing my words carefully. Our officers are at a breaking point. It is not right for our country to do this to these human beings. And so I think we have to get very serious. If we're going to be serious about security, and I think we should be, if we're going to be serious about the economy in this country, and I think we should be, we've got to get serious about getting those 3,700 CBP officers hired, because there is a direct relationship to the benefit of our security, and there's a direct relationship to the benefit to our economy.
To your knowledge, what staffing model does CBP use to determine port of entry staffing needs?
Well, I know they have a workforce staffing model. In terms of its precise name or anything, I'm not familiar with that. So, I mean, I could probably get that to you, but I don't have that with me today. But it is their workforce staffing model that suggests that we are 2,500 short, and just to be clear, we are also 1,200. We have 1,200 vacancies from the 2,000 officers that were funded in 2014. So that's where I get the 1,200 plus the 2,500 gives you the 3,700.
Thank you so much, and I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Barletta for 5 minutes from Pennsylvania.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here today and for your service to our country. As you know, we have immigration laws for two basic reasons: to protect our national security and to protect American jobs. Unless and until we have complete control of our borders, it will remain impossible to fulfill this obligation. And I'm pleased that we have a partner in the White House who is actively working towards this goal to ensure the safety and prosperity of the American people. Now, I have dealt with this firsthand and the consequences of our federal government's failure to enforce our immigration laws. I was the mayor of a city that had an illegal immigration problem. We are 2,000 miles away from our nearest southern border. I don't need to be briefed on this issue. I lived it every single day. Our population in Hazleton grew by nearly 50%, but our tax revenue stayed the same. It became impossible for cities like ours, small cities, to deal with the problems that comes with the problem of illegal immigration, such as drugs, gangs, identity theft, fraud, and everything else that happens with it. I came down to Washington in December of 2005 and asked for help. I met with the Department of Justice, and they were great. They brought in all these experts to talk to me, and at the end of the meeting, at the end of the day, I got this nice coffee mug. I got a lapel pin, I got a pat on the back, and they sent me home. Very shortly after that, a 29-year-old city man, Derek Kishline, father of 3 little children, he had some words with the head of the Latin Kings, who was in the country illegally, a man that was arrested 6 times and left go in sanctuary cities. The man went and got a gun, stuck it between Derek's eyes, shot and killed him. We spent half of our yearly budget in overtime in the police department in catching him and his buddy. I had to sit with Mr. and Mrs. Kishline, and I had to sit with the family and explain why this man was still in the country and their son is gone. I had enough at that point. The federal government failed us. They weren't going to do anything. I created the first law in America as a mayor to try to deal with that problem, and I was sued immediately by illegal aliens. So here we are, 2018, and we're still talking about it. I've always been told that we must have compassion for the people who come here illegally, but no one speaks up for the victims of these crimes. Mr. Ampenson and Ms. Pepperdine, what do you see as the most effective means of deterring illegal immigration once and for all? And tell me how sanctuary cities make it more difficult to enforce our immigration laws. I was sued being a mayor wanting to enforce our laws, and now we have over 380 mayors thumbing their nose at the federal government creating safe havens for people who are in the country illegally. I'd like to hear your opinion.
Well, you mentioned it there, enforce the laws that we have on the books. In the Del Rio sector, we were the first ones to implement what was previously called Operation Streamline, which meant that anybody arrested crossing the border illegally in our sector went to jail for some period of time. If it was your first time crossing, you might see a week, 10 days maybe. If you had crossed multiple times, you're going to see more time in jail. And ultimately, I don't have the percentage, but it led to a significant drop in apprehensions in our sector, and that deterred, at least in our area, but then it just pushed it elsewhere. With the interior of the country, it's gotten to a point where they feel once they pass the border, they're home free. There are no repercussions to being illegally present in the U.S., and we do have laws on the books to do this. We do. There's no reason not to enforce them, but that's what's been going on.
Thank you. Ms. Pepperdine?
I agree with Mr. Anfinson. I also believe assurance of apprehension at the border is a huge deterrent in illegal immigration. You asked about the safe havens. They definitely hurt us in the long run, not just us as agents doing our job, but the American people.
I'd like to apologize to all the families across this country who are victims of illegal immigration. You know, the focus is always on the illegal immigrant that comes here for a better life, but there are families there that have lost loved ones, and here we are. And I hope once and for all we do the right thing and secure our borders, and then deal with the problem on the interior. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Correa from California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I just wanted to thank all the officers for good job you do for all our citizens, and also want to tell all the victims of crimes in this country, those perpetrators with and without documents, we're coming after all of you. We're not going to make any distinction. Gentlemen, ma'am, I had a chance to tour the San Ysidro border again a few months ago, and we have some great officers with, great attitudes, and a few of them were very proud to tell me about their big arrests, their big busts, drug busts of these big shipments. Most of the shipments, by the way, are coming through border ports of entry. It's not folks with backpacks sprinting across the mountains. It's folks driving across our border crossings, either through vehicles, family vehicles, or trucks. And I asked these folks, how are you able to spot the shipments? And it was interesting because without a doubt, without a beat, they told me the experienced officer was the one that could look into the driver's eyes, they could look into passenger's eyes and say, there's something not right here. And then what they would do is bring over the police dogs, the drug-sniffing dogs, and bingo, you had massive arrests because of the massive drug shipments that they could identify. Conclusion, you're absolutely right. We need more agents, more of those blue agents on the border to be able to identify the illicit drugs and other smuggling operations. You need more dogs there. They've proven to be better than any other technology that we have today. And so given the limited resources that we have, I mean, where do we put our money? Do we put it on building another wall, another fence, or do we put in more personnel and bring in more, dogs and other technologies to identify these illicit shipments at border points of entry? And by the way, I'm going to say we also need them to make sure that commerce, good commerce, comes to and from the United States. Mexico's, I think, our biggest trading partner in the world. So we want to create jobs. We want to make sure that commerce continues to be healthy. So again, my question to all of you is, if you had to prioritize investment, where would it go?
It's got to be a combination of the two. It's got to be.
If you had to prioritize, sir,
you can. It's got to be a holistic approach.
A, B, or C.
You can't just say one is the key that's going to stop everything that we face. You have to look at everything.
In San Ysidro, you have 3 fences, I believe, in some areas?
Well, I worked.
It's a question, sir.
I worked as an intel agent, so I was able to analyze. I was also a canine handler. But I worked as an
I'm not being argumentative with you. I'm saying in San Isidro, do we have 3 fences there right now in some areas?
We have double fencing, which has been very effective in those areas, yes.
So when you say holistic, San Isidro is the most crossed border entry point in the world. How can we make that much more effective? Where would you invest the money?
As far as ports of entry, we're going to have to yield to Mr. Reardon. That's where he works. I work in between the ports of entry.
Mr. Reardon.
Congressman, thank you for the question, and I'm more than happy to answer it. Without question, I would put the resources into our human resources. We are, as I said, short a large number of CBP officers at San Ysidro. There are TDYs that are required as a result, which leaves other ports short-staffed and vulnerable. And yet we are still short people in San Ysidro. And the impact on officers, on their health, on their families, on the entire system is dramatic. And yes, there is an economic impact. For every 33 officers, and these are CBP numbers, for every 33 officers hired, we could expect to bring in 1,000 private sector jobs. So if we're going to take the economy seriously and we're worried about jobs, there's a primary candidate for it.
I'm running out of time. I just want to thank you for the straight answer. As a policymaker, that's all I want is good information so I can figure out how to make these decisions. Mr. Judd, absolutely right. It's a holistic approach. But, you know, when you have a limited number of taxpayer dollars, you want to figure out where they go. And I have talked to those, border agents, overworked, but you know that they do a great job. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before we go to Mr. Rutherford, I am going to have to step out to go to the White House for an important bicameral, bipartisan meeting with the President. Just know that I will be advocating for the agents and everything that you need in order to secure our border, reasonable changes that need to happen in order to make sure we keep our country and community safe. So I apologize for having to step out for this important meeting. Mr. Hurd from Texas will be coming into the chair, and the chair now recognizes, is Rutherford coming in the chair? Who's coming in the chair? Yeah, he's the vice chair, so he's coming into the chair. But you are now recognized. Okay. So hold that thought for a second. Do you want your name tag there? Okay. Exactly. Anyway, thanks for all you do, and hold that thought here. Mr. Hurd, you want to start coming back? All right, you got it. You're in charge, right? Let Rutherford take it. Chair now recognizes Mr. Rutherford for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, listen, let me say, I've heard others. First of all, thank you all for your service in a very, very tough job. And I know we've had other witnesses here speak to us about apprehension, securing the border, and what that would look like. And really, the conversation was about, you need an impediment to slow them down, whether that's a wall or it's electronic, to detect. Then you need to detect whoever's coming through. And then finally, and I think most critically, as Mr. Reardon has pointed out, then you have to have the human assets on the boots on the ground to actually apprehend those folks once they breach your impediment. Now, what the impediment requires is a wall, some electronics, whatever that might be. I know in the Rio Grande, good Lord, they're even using these static balloons. World War II stuff. It's horrible. Yet, around, I think it's pronounced Fort Huachuca, they have drones and other devices that are incredibly effective. They have the big pipe, as they call it, so their communications is working great in those areas. But, But then when you look at these three areas, when you look at the impediment, the detection, and the apprehension, and we talk about, you know, the physical barriers and the needs for those physical barriers, and the lack of them in the Rio Grande Valley, which is where, you know, we did a CODEL to the southern border, and it looked like they got to around Fort Huachuca and ran out of money. You know, we were going from San Diego east, and the Rio Grande is they're in deep need of help with the physical border. On the detection piece, when you talk about the communications, and then I hear Ms. Pepperdine talking about, you know, the lack of communications, that you can actually see someone, but you can't communicate with them on your radio. That doesn't work. So they actually use a cell phone. Their cell phone works better than their radio communications. And Lord, then you get to the apprehension piece and you talk about the manpower. And, you know, Mr. Reardon has very well pointed out, you know, this 3,700 CBP officers short, 1,200 in these ports. And I know I was a sheriff for 12 years in Florida, worked closely with my colleague, Ms. Stemmings, and I can tell you, I understand the drain that puts on your personnel and the impact that it has on their efficiency. And so, you know, when all of that fails, then in the interior in Jacksonville, for example, I had to start a 287G program in my community because we had a subculture that had grown in the illegal community, and not only were they violent toward citizens, as Mr. Barletta pointed out, folks, they're also violent toward each other. Incredible amounts of rape and domestic abuse that's going unreported because they don't want to be deported. And so we started a 287G program to identify these individuals when they were in our jail so that we could deport them. Mike, I just want to make a commitment to you, and I'll ask Mr. Reardon, because I believe the place you have to start is with the manpower. What can we do to help you? Besides, you know, we've passed a bill to not require the polygraph so that we can cut down on the time to hire. What else can we do? Raises, I would imagine, would help. When I see 25 to 40% of their income in a year is on overtime, that's not a good thing. That's a bad thing. Yes, it increases their salary and their take-home, but it also leads to all of those issues that you pointed out before, suicide, domestic violence, and other issues. Could you please answer that? My time has run out. And I yield back.
Certainly, Congressman. Thank you very much. I will try to go quickly through this. I think one is we've already talked about the length of time to onboard staff. I think the segmented hiring process that exists creates a lot of problems, and that is sort of a subset of the hiring delays. I mean, in the past, I know it took in the neighborhood of 16 to 18 months to onboard somebody. No one that I know can wait that period of time in order to take a job. They're going to go work for the sheriff. They're going to work for a local police department or wherever. So that's important. We talked about the polygraph. The fact that we have a 63 to 66% failure rate in the polygraphs is unconscionable. Something's wrong. Something should be done immediately to fix that, and I know we're working on that. I think also related to the polygraph, right now, if an individual is identified with a no opinion result, or an inconclusive result, or a no opinion countermeasures finding, they have to wait an extended period of time before they can retest. I think they should be able to retest immediately. I think that in terms of FLETC, where our officers go to train, Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, I think it is it's important that we expand the number of classes. I think it's important that we look at the potential for having 6 days of training rather than 5, as long as, of course, people are paid for 6 days. That's an important piece. But I also think one other thing that can be done is, right now there is something known as post-FLETC training. So the person goes to FLETC, they go through all their training, they then go back to their port, and then they are in a post-FLETC training period for 10 months. And what I'm hearing from my officers is that's too long. That certainly they need to go through the training, certainly they need to be prepared to work on the line, work primary, work secondary, but 10 months is too long. So those are the things that I would offer.
Thank you, Mr. Reuter. Now the distinguished gentlewoman from California, Ms. Barragan, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today. I think this is an important topic. My concern is about the timing. We're at a time where it appears that there's an effort being made to portray immigrants as violent criminals, to justify these anti-immigration actions and policies. It's also a time when we're debating dreamers and the future of U.S. immigration policy. I think it's key to hear from officers from the front lines and to learn about the dangers that we face daily so Congress can work to address real border security threats. But I think it's also important to be clear about what groups we're talking about here today. And the way I see this is we're really talking about the drug cartels, criminal aliens, hardened criminals who are responsible for violence at the border. Mr. Judd, would you agree with that?
I would agree that we need to address the violent criminals at the border.
Mr. Judd, do you support a legislative solution that puts dreamers on the pathway to citizenship?
I support anything that when we're going to talk about comprehensive immigration reform. When we talked about it in 2013, we talked about border security. You have to secure the border first before we look at something like that. Otherwise, we're right back in the same situation. Now, if we secure the border, absolutely. When you look at dreamers, the difference between dreamers as opposed to other people is there was no intent to break the law. They never had an intent to break the law. They didn't come here knowingly to break the law, and so they're in a little bit different situation. But the problem is that parents are able to use them to circumvent.
Mr. Judd, I'm just asking you about the dreamers, okay? And my question is, do you support a pathway for the dreamers?
I support border security and then look at anything beyond that.
Okay. Well, there was a video of you in February 27, 2017, where you specifically went on to support the dreamers, and you said, quote, to no fault of their own, and they came to this country, and as you know, why would we want to send somebody that came here when they're 1-year-old back, and that, quote, it's common sense to find a pathway to them to stay in this country, end quote, when we're talking about the dreamers. Did you not say that?
I did.
Okay, thank you. I'm not trying to be argumentative. It was a very simple question, and it didn't seem like you wanted to reconfirm what you had previously said in the past. I want to talk a little bit about body cameras. If anybody on this panel maybe want to comment on this. I think, unfortunately, our agents and officers are confronted an uptick in violence at the border. Again, it's stemming, I think, from the cartels, from violence, drug cartels, rather, and criminal aliens attempting to illegally enter. The use of body-worn cameras is something that's been considered a best practice in law enforcement agencies. As we've seen, it increases accountability and transparency. In LA, where I represent, the LAPD has placed body cameras on thousands of officers. Just quickly, do you have an opinion, yes or no, just down the panel, whether you think body cameras would be effective to try to put into place?
I think they can be effective. The problem is we haven't yet seen a camera that can handle the environment that we work in.
Okay. Anybody else?
We've looked at all cameras, and if there is a camera that can handle our environment, absolutely.
Ms. Pepperdine?
Definitely. We don't work like most law enforcement. It's not the same kind of beat. Our terrain is rugged, and because of that, it's hard to find a camera that we can utilize. But I love the idea of having a camera.
Mr. Reardon?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Currently, there are some pilots going on for our folks, and we are supportive of those pilots.
Great, thank you. Mr. Reardon, back in October, our committee, Homeland, held a field hearing at the Port of Los Angeles to talk about security at the ports. You submitted a statement for the record asserting that staffing shortages at the seaports nationwide are especially acute. I want to thank you for doing that, and thank you for your testimony here today. I was drawn by when I saw reports that the President's proposal had included more money for Border Patrol agents, but really didn't include any more money for Customs officers, which I believe the greatest threat from what I have learned in my committee is going to come through seaports and airports. And so I want to applaud the work that you are doing, not just at the Port of Los Angeles, where I represent the largest port and busiest port by container volume, but for what your employees do to secure our ports. And I'm with you in believing that if we're going to put more money, they need to be to help the human assets that we have to increase morale and making sure they're not working 73 hours of overtime, which is, as you state, is absolutely just unacceptable. Thank you. I yield back.
It's now my pleasure to recognize a gentleman who has served his country his entire adult life, the gentleman from Nebraska, General Bacon. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all of you for helping defend our country. And Mr. Judd, I think most Americans agree, at least in my district, that we want to solve the problem and provide a long-term solution for DACA. What I hear from folks in our district is if you just solve the long-term issue for the DACA youth who are here, we're going to have to do it again in 3 years and 5 years and 7 years if we don't find a solution at the border and fix the border as well as our visas. So I think what you're saying represents the majority view of what I'm hearing in our district. One of the things that concern me I've only been a part of this committee now for about a month, and had a recent hearing, and I heard from the Homeland Security folks that we have captured Sunni extremists trying to come through our southern border. So often when we talk about border security, we focus on immigration, and it becomes controversial. But I think we forget the fact that there are people in the Middle East that know that we have a porous border, and they're trying to come over the border. And it's granted, maybe out of 1,000, we're talking 1 or 2. But 1 or 2 suicide bombers is unacceptable. I think if we put a little more emphasis on the Al-Qaeda, the ISIS threat, this will help unify our country better at knowing that we do got to do something more for our border security. But I'd love to have your thoughts on that, Mr. Judd. Are we missing the boat on our messaging?
We are. In fact, what needs to happen is CBP needs to release to the public the number of people that we're catching from countries of special interest. Like right now, we're catching an awful lot of people that are claiming to be from Bangladesh, but our agents believe that they're from Afghanistan. And when they're interviewed, because we don't have those language skills, so we have to use AT&T interpreters or some other interpreter, they're telling us they're not from Bangladesh. And so what needs to happen is CBP needs to let the American public know that this is what we're dealing with. We're not just dealing with people from the country of Mexico. We're dealing with people from all over the world, including from special interest countries.
Absolutely. And I brought this up to the Homeland Security representatives. I did not get a good answer why we are not telling the American people that we're capturing Al-Qaeda and ISIS operatives come over our border. And I think the impression I'm getting is they don't want to talk about how we caught them. Fair enough. We don't have to do that. But the American people deserve to know that we've had suicide bombers with that intent trying to come here. And I think that would provide a more unifying conversation of what we got to do at the border and why. It's not just about immigration. It's about security. Now, I've only been part of this committee again for just a month, and I've heard a couple times now from our friends on the other side of the aisle comparing the Canadian border with our border in the south. Could you give me your views of how these two borders compare threat-wise, volume of threat-wise, the volume of violence committed against our border people? Thank you.
There's no comparison of the number of illegal crossings that are taking place, whether it be on the southwest border, the northern border. The numbers are astronomical on the southwest border, and again, from countries that you would never think are coming here. But all indications show that if terrorists are going to come across the border, they're going to use the path of least resistance, which is going to be the northern border, because we have very few agents on the northern border, and it's very easy to come across. Now, because we have very few agents on the northern border, and it's very easy to come across. Now, we're seeing it on the southwest border. The problem is we just don't know what's crossing on the northern border because we're not very effective up there simply due to our numbers.
So we need to put some emphasis in both areas.
We do.
Okay. Now, for our remaining panelists, I wanted to ask you, as you look at the wall that we're talking about putting, what is and you've referred to it a little bit, what is optimal? A 2,000-mile wall, or just focus in some key areas? And what should that wall look like? Should it be something you can look through? What would be the optimal configuration from your perspective?
Well, it's become pretty clear we don't need a wall from coast to the Gulf. We just don't. There are some areas it's just not feasible to build it. There's a lake in my area that we're not building a wall there, and there are other spots along the river where it's going to be extremely difficult to build, and it wouldn't be feasible. So in those areas where we're not building a wall, that's where the technology piece comes in: cameras, additional sensor technology, and of course more agents. And as far as what the wall would look like, I mean, we've seen some prototypes there, but ideally, it doesn't necessarily need to be see-through, but we need to be able to see what's happening on the other side. So maybe see-through, but maybe we use cameras. The idea is we need to see what's on the other side, preparing to try to get past the wall so we can prepare ourselves.
So if I hear you right, there's selected areas that we need to put physical security barriers in, but not the 2,000-mile wall. But you think there are key areas that we need to focus on?
Absolutely.
Okay. Ms. Pepperdine?
The wall is definitely necessary. It does not need to be a physical wall in some areas. You don't need a pedestrian wall. Some areas we could utilize vehicle barriers. Mm-hmm. That's what we use in Tucson sector, at least in Casa Grande Station. We're utilizing vehicle barriers, and that's been very effective. But we definitely, in some areas, do need a pedestrian wall.
Okay, thank you very much. And I just want to close by thanking Mr. Reardon for your comments on the economic impacts. I think you have a very valid point. And with that, Chairman, I yield back.
I recognize myself for 5 minutes. First off, I appreciate the panel being here today and talking about something that a lot of people talk about but don't have any experience the way that y'all do. And I would like to thank Mr. Judd and Mr. Anfinson specifically for all the work you've done to educate me on this important issue. Mr. Anfinson has taken me through Carrizo Crane on lakes, and I've gotten a real-world experience, and that experience has allowed me to come educate my colleagues that your push-to-talk radios don't work in some places. Your cell phone coverage doesn't work in some places, and that y'all's experience is important. And so we talked about a lot of topics today. I think everybody agrees we don't have the manpower, and we have to have the strategies in place to hit the manpower needs that we should be achieving. I think there's actually not much disagreement on that. My question is, and for all four of y'all, if you can answer in a short response, because I have a couple more, is our manpower in the right places? We have limited manpower, but is the manpower in the right places? Mr. Judge, why don't you start us off?
At times, that's you can't answer that question without going into in depth, but I'd be happy to sit down with you and discuss that.
John?
We need more in certain areas like Big Bend sector, for example. I know they're understaffed. We also have a lot of agents who spend their times indoors processing or doing other administrative work when they could be out in the field.
Put them on the border, huh?
That's right.
Ms. Pepperdine?
Definitely agree with them. We definitely have a lot of details, a lot of agents detailed out, so we're not actually on the border. We definitely need to break some of those details down and bring them back.
Mr. Reardon?
Congressman, thank you. In addition to not having enough CBPOs, we also have, in my view, too many managers. In 2003, there was a ratio of...
This was the 1 to 4 versus the
1 to 12 at that time in the ports. Now it is 1 to 5.6. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a problem. And I would also agree that for our CBPOs, too many of them are spending time doing administrative work when they could be on the front lines, and I think that's something that needs to be addressed.
And maybe this next question for Mr. Reardon and Mr. Judd, but John and Ms. Pepperton, I welcome your feedback. Have the unions given a suggestion or idea of a plan on an incentive, on a structure and how do you incent the right behavior? How do you make sure you have officers that are willing to go to some of these remote places, like in some places in Big Bend, in order to address that morale question when you're in hardship? So having served in a few hardship places during my career with the CIA, I understand the model that is created in order to incent that behavior, and it seems that within y'all's ranks we don't have that. So Mr. Judd, you want to lead off?
We have, and I think that CBP is looking at addressing that issue now. Right now, we have a very good leader at the top. I think that if you look at the structure within CBP and the Border Patrol, our top leader, our second, and our third are absolutely fantastic, and they're looking at these issues, and I think they're going to address them.
We'd welcome, the committee would welcome the suggestions and the points that you do have, just so that we can get familiar with that.
Will do.
Mr. Reardon, do you have anything else to add?
I do. Thank you.
Yeah.
You know, there are recruitment, relocation, and retention bonuses that are available now. I mean, the opportunity to provide those exists already. Whether there's funding or not is certainly a different matter. But so I think better utilizing those sorts of bonuses, I think, would be helpful. But I will also tell you that, you know, where we talk about morale, I think we need to deal, as I had indicated before, with appropriations for additional CBPOs. But there's one other thing, that when we're looking at trying to make a career at CBP more attractive, I think it is difficult to try to go out and recruit folks, and at the same time, they're hearing in the media the potential for federal employees, all federal employees, getting another pay freeze. Yep. That is a non-starter.
Good. Loud and clear. This committee has spoken on this topic. We've included incentives in several sections of the border security bill that was passed out of here. And as a former government employee, I guess I still am a government employee, I recognize the needs and the difficulties that y'all go through. And so I appreciate y'all coming up here to continue to educate, and I appreciate y'all's willingness to take many of our colleagues and our staff and show them the real-world examples of what y'all have to go through every single day. And we're going to have to continue to do that. We're going to have to continue to educate our colleagues so that we can start making better decisions up here to support the important efforts that you do. Now it's a pleasure to recognize my colleague from the great state of Texas, Mr. Vela. You're now recognized.
Thank you. I've got a couple more questions before we break here. And in about 5 minutes, our leadership from both parties is going to the White House to talk about many of the issues we've discussed here today. But Mr. Reardon, I think you mentioned that probably the single most important factor that you think is important to address are the 1,200 agents that we're short of. And I understand with the other formula you're talking about could be another 2,500, right? And Mr. Judd, I'm sure that with respect to the shortage of 1,900 officers that we're short of on the Border Patrol side, with currently mandated funding, right? That you see that as critical as well. So, knowing that we've got our folks on the way over there, what's the message? I mean, what can we do, given the current dialogue, to help get the 1,200 officers we need on the CBPO side and the 1,900 officers on the Border Patrol side, in the next year?
We've got to look at what needs to be done to retain our employees, and there's a lot of things that need to be done. We need to change the culture within the Border Patrol. We need to look at the pay issues within the Border Patrol, and we need to make those pay issues equal across the boards. I mean, if you look at CBPO officers and you look at Border Patrol, if you look at their overtime, they get double pay for every hour that they work. A Border Patrol agent gets straight pay for every hour they work. A CBPO officer for Sunday pay gets 50%. A Border Patrol agent gets 25%. Night differential, CBP officers can go all the way up to 25%, whereas a Border Patrol agent caps out at 10%. And so you look at our sister agency, and we don't even have pay parity within our agencies within CBP. And so you have to look at those issues. But what I would really like to see is I would like to see us secure our borders so that we can deal with issues like Dreamers, like immigration reform, like those issues, so that we can take care of those issues that allows us to move together instead of in a partisan fashion, which has been so disruptive to this country to this point.
Right, but aren't you also saying that in order to do that, we need to take care of this issue of 1,900 officers that we're short of? Right?
We do. We have to retain our employees and hire those 1,900 agents.
Mr. Reardon.
Yes, thank you, Congressman. I think there are several things. I think number one, providing appropriations for additional staffing, I think, is important. I think fixing the polygraph problem is something that is important. I think fixing the hiring process so that it doesn't take 16 to 18 months or even 9 months to onboard somebody. I heard, I was talking to one of our officers not that long ago, and he told me, it only took me about 8 months to be onboarded. And I have to tell you, I found myself at that moment thinking, wow, that's really great. And then when you think about it, that's crazy. It should not take that long. So I think something has to be done to fix that as well. I also, as I just said prior, I think we have to make sure that we are better utilizing the recruitment, relocation, and retention bonuses that are available. And I will tell you that I think oftentimes in agencies, many of the personnel folks don't fully understand how to utilize those. So I think it's important that OPM or wherever they would get that training from, and that understanding of how to better utilize the 3 R's as they're known, I think is also important.
One last question for you, Mr. Reardon. The President's budget proposed shifting the funding of CBP officers to more fee-based versus direct funding and investments for improvement at ports of entry. What's your thoughts on that budget proposal?
Well, I think it is important to make the appropriations available to fully fund the number of CBP officers that we need. I think to get into a situation where we're basing everything on fees or a majority on fees is a difficult place to be. Now, that's not to say that fees aren't important, because in fact fees are important, and I would also suggest that any of the fees that are available right now, that they not be directed in other areas, that they be focused on bringing in more staffing. But for me, I think it's important, to the extent that we can, to fully fund all of our CBP officers and the additional ones that we need.
Well, thank all of you again for your time today.
I'd like to thank the witnesses for y'all's valuable testimony, and I want to thank the members for y'all's questions. Many of the members of the committee will have additional questions that we will ask you to respond to in writing if those exist. And pursuant to Committee Rule 7E, the hearing record will be held open for 10 days, and without objection, the committee stands adjourned.